If I can't see that it's pork or shrimp, I can pretend it's not there.
I grew up eating this food and you used to make fun of me, and now you're like waiting in lines.
I usually eat my latkes with garlic chili sauce. Some people might call it sacrilegious. I think it just adds the perfect amount of kick.
Both sides of my family, food is a very big deal. You move somewhere and they come in with like bags upon bags of food.
Both my grandmas on the Jewish side and the Thai side use food as a way to show their love. You just have to be constantly eating. There's always something on the table.
My father, my grandfather, and my uncle are kosher caterers. Food was ingrained in my blood.
One of the first things my mom did when she got married to my dad was she went to the bookstore and she bought a Jewish cookbook.
I just remember going to Japan every year, just being excited about what I'd eat for every meal.
Learning how to make bebinka from my auntie Novelle.
Calling my dad on FaceTime and saying, okay, I don't know what you're in the middle of, but please put it aside. I need help to make some keema.
Waking up in Thailand and my Chinese Thai grandmother walking in wearing this neon jumpsuit, a sweatband around her permed hair, and she's got a bag of sticky rice and a bag of bing.
Sitting in the kitchen with my dad, and he would show that you would measure oil using half of the eggshell.
Eating my mom's home-cooked meals, or when I went to Israel and ate Israeli food.
When I bake challah on Fridays, there's these moments that just help me feel like, oh, I do have stake in Filipino identity, and I do have stake in Jewish identity because these foods have meaning to me, these foods have memories to me.
Growing up, we would eat Costa Rican food and Ashkenazi Jewish food, except for rice. Rice was always in a rice maker, white rice, not the toasted way.
One night I would have matzah soup or some other Jewish dish, and the other night an Indonesian beef soup or something like that.
Food kind of fills a void in my Asian cultural experience.
Moving to Arkansas, there's such a tiny Asian community here, and then a tinier Filipino community.
There wasn't like a Thai community center, there wasn't a Thai Buddhist temple. My aunt worked in Thai restaurants, so she brings food when she visited. It's strange that that's my most significant and long-lasting connection to Thai culture, because with Jewish culture, I've been much more enmeshed in Jewish communities.
My personal connection is definitely more Jewish food. I grew up with it, my family cooks it. Chinese food, which is amazing cuisine. I did not really grow up with it. If I go to a Chinese restaurant, people talk to me in Mandarin and I always feel so bad because I have no idea what they're saying. The way I look does not really line up with how I was raised.
When I feel that I need to prove my Jewishness, if I'm in like a really white Jewish space, something I can easily lean on and be like, this like bagel we're all eating at this potluck, I like this. I think that kind of comes from a sad place that I feel like I have to prove myself, but it has been a thing to me like, yes, I recognize this food. This is a clear indicator that I am Jewish enough. Also, I just love bagels.
My family really didn't keep Shabbat, didn't really eat challah together. Most of my experiences with Jewish food came at Jewish summer camp, talking to some of my friends. They would talk about foods that are part, I guess, the Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine, and I had never heard of those foods before. Not knowing those sometimes made me feel like I'm not Jewish enough, like I would feel shame because I also had this mixed identity.
At synagogue or a Jewish event, they have very European Ashkenazi Jewish food, and that doesn't always feel like home. When I've been able to find Indian restaurants that are kosher or these overlapping things that appeal to my identity, then I get really excited and I'm like, we all have to go there all the time.
When I started to keep kosher, that was like a huge conflict.
I would only eat with friends who only also kept full kosher, and we were always going to full kosher restaurants. It really helped me connect to the community, but I also feel like that disconnected me from my Asian culture because I wasn't able to eat any sort of like authentic Asian food.
There's so many treif proteins that are just so hugely part of Korean cuisine, but just really all Asian cuisine.
Tell me all you want how great that Asian certified kosher restaurant is. That's American Chinese food, friends.
I had a really hard time losing dishes that I totally grew up with and loved. Like some of my favorite foods were treif foods, and I can no longer have them.
Today I wanted to make pad thai and I couldn't find kosher fish oil anywhere.
I've done my best to modify as much as I can, but certain things I'll just never get to eat again, which is super sad and felt like a huge loss of identity.
It was so hard to find food that wasn't kosher and Ashkenazi. My realm was so Ashkenormative. All I knew was like Ashkenazi food.
I do find that Buddhist temple cuisine matches up perfectly because it's basically all vegan, so it's an easy way to be able to eat Asian food and be keeping kosher.
In my household, we keep kosher and halal. How those two align actually end up being incredibly similar. They generally follow a lot of the same, we don't eat this and we eat this way.
are a lot of similarities. Foods are tied into the lunar calendar, mooncake, specific foods in the fall, like apples and honey. There's more of like an inherent calendar connection and like flow of a shared story.
On my Chinese side, my grandmother knew how to butcher animals to feed her family. And that goes back to that notion of being resourceful and showing respect to the animal, the same way that kashrut laws respect to animals, and when it comes to plants, respecting where it comes from.
If you grow up in a very white society, Jewish foods and Asian foods are kind of looked at as like, ew, what's that? Like gefilte fish. I personally love gefilte fish.
I never felt comfortable bringing Asian food to school. Y'all have seen that meme where it's like, I grew up eating this food and you used to make fun of me, and now you're like waiting in lines to eat at this restaurant.
Philosophically, it's all the cuisine of the downtrodden, people who can't get whole cuts of meat, people who have to like scrounge at vegetable scraps. With Jewish food and a lot of Asian food, it's basically peasant food, but I think it's beautiful to like bring together these foods that were based around making do with what you have.
A lot of love is put into Asian cuisine, and a lot of love is put into Jewish food, making shopal dough, challah dough, and just like how long my mom would take to make Filipino food, and then I'm just thinking how long it takes to make some Jewish food. It brings people together versus some American food where it's just like picked up, bought, and people eat fast and they're on their way.
A lot of my Indonesian community is very recent in terms of their immigration to the United States. This is how they connect and keep true to their roots in Indonesia. They get together, have Indonesian food, and discuss things in Bahasa Indonesian. The Jewish community in general has unfortunately had like a really huge diaspora, and I feel like one of the things that's kept it together through times of turmoil and crisis has been food and this love for community.
I grew up eating Malaysian Chinese food where my mom is from, based on a Chinese diaspora to Malaysia. Even that food that I consider Malaysian food is influenced by a diaspora that happened.
My Jewish background food is mostly Russian, Ashkenazi, and it's usually quite plain, influenced by like what the Soviet Union went through, like famine and kind of what Jews went through millennia. Whereas like my Indian side, my grandmother cooks in South Africa. It's much more luxurious, focused on spice, different meats. Yeah, Jewish food, at least the Russian my mother makes, it's not heavy on meat. Like there's a lot of beets and cabbage, but Indian food like pushes on shrimp, chicken, beef.
One of my favorite scenes from the Marvelous Mrs Maisel, which has some problematic things. I have a love-hate relationship with that show, but her wedding is catered by a Chinese restaurant, and she ends the wedding speech by saying, and by the way, there's pork and shrimp in the egg rolls, and everyone riots. It dates back to this generalization of Jewish people loving American Chinese food. Oh, Jewish people on Christmas go to a Chinese restaurant. And I was thinking, like, why is that? For one, in New York, Chinatown and the Lower East Side were bordering each other, and people were constantly interacting. The other thing is, as much as we think Asian food isn't kosher, generally Asian food doesn't cook with animal milk very often. So in a lot of ways, Chinese food was actually a restaurant where you could be sure that meat and milk weren't mixing in your food. There was also this kind of idea of like, if I can't see that it's pork or shrimp, I can pretend it's not there. Safe trafe, what they called it. Like, if it's in a wonton and I don't know what it is, it's fine. It's one of the earliest examples in American history of two cultures that we normally think of as very separate, coming together and partaking in each other's food.
I actually think Jewish foods and Asian foods go very well together. I actually wrote an article for my magazine called Jews and Asians Go Together Like Peanut Butter and Jelly.
It doesn't really matter where you're from. Jewish food is basically just taking the food of the region and making it kosher or symbolic. Like, this is now going to be the food you eat on Passover or something like that.
Even though my family is not Jewish in India, there are Jews in India. You can have pakora on Hanukkah and it's not unheard of. That's really fun to break the stereotype of, you want Jewish food? Okay, it's a bagel.
I grew up eating oshplo, and then I met somebody from Uzbekistan, and they were like, you know how to make that too? Yeah, our version is very similar. It's Asian food, but it's still Jewish food.
My parents growing up, they always had this bottle of teriyaki marinade, and it was soy vey. It was a fusion marinade. I don't know how they found this, but they were like, it represents our family.
Definitely thinking about soy vey as well. It's definitely a staple in our fridge. We really love soba noodles, udon, and anything buckwheat. It would be really cool if they familiar with soba, udon, and like matzo ball soup. I would eat that up really quickly.
Chicken broth seems to be a common denominator. Like a matzo ball soup broth could go really well with a huindun or like a wonton Chinese soup.
I think it would be really interesting to do gefilte fish with like a Japanese sushi hand roll.
We made hamantaschen and it had ube jam in the center. It was the bomb. You have to try it.
I haven't actually had this, but I was thinking it would be really awesome to do matzo ball soup with ramen noodles because those are two of my favorite foods.
I recently went to a restaurant in Brooklyn called Shalom Japan, and they have on the menu Rachel matzo ball ramen soup.
Oh my god! Wow, you've actually had my dream food. I'm so jealous.
We all should go.
We should take a trip, like a big lunar trip.
Let's just all get a minivan and travel. I think that would be so fun.